Hello, survivors. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the story. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to our channel. We appreciate it, and thank you in advance. Please leave the name of the city you're listening from in the comment section below. It helps us see our reach in the community. Let's start the story. The sea was unusually calm that morning. I remember thinking it was almost too peaceful as I stood on the bridge of HMS Queen Elizabeth, Britain's largest and most advanced aircraft carrier. The kind of deceptive calm that often precedes a devastating storm. It was 05:30 on Tuesday, October 12th. We were stationed 20 nautical miles off the eastern coast of the United States, participating in joint exercises with the U.S. Navy. 6 escort vessels maintained a protective perimeter around us. 2 Type 45 destroyers, HMS Defender and HMS Diamond, along with 4 Type 23 frigates. Standard carrier group formation. Nothing out of the ordinary. My name is Captain Malcolm Forrester, 22 years in the Royal Navy, the last 3 commanding this 65,000-ton behemoth, with its complement of 1,600 crew members and air personnel. I'd seen my share of crises during deployments in the Persian Gulf and Mediterranean, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that day. The first indication came at 06:12 when our communications officer, Lieutenant Reed, reported unusual chatter from civilian emergency channels in Boston and New York. "Sir, I'm picking up multiple distress calls. Emergency services appear to be overwhelmed. Something about violent attacks throughout both cities." I ordered him to monitor all frequencies while I contacted Rear Admiral Harrison aboard HMS Defender. Before he could respond, Lieutenant Commander Walsh, our intelligence officer, burst onto the bridge. "Captain, you need to see this." Her face was pale as she handed me her tablet. The screen showed live news footage from Boston, chaos in the streets, people running and others attacking them. The camera was shaking, but I could clearly see individuals exhibiting bizarre, aggressive behavior, lunging at anyone nearby. The attackers moved with a horrible, single-minded determination, their bodies twisted in unnatural postures as they pursued fleeing civilians. "What am I looking at?" "Walsh?" I asked, though a cold weight had already settled in my stomach. "Initial reports suggest some form of highly contagious pathogen, sir. Causes extreme aggression and is spread through bites or fluid contact. CDC issued an emergency alert 5 minutes ago. I've made difficult decisions throughout my career, but what followed in the next few minutes would define everything that came after. I ordered an immediate communications link with British Naval Command and the U.S. Navy's 6th Fleet. Then I assembled my senior officers for an emergency briefing. Commander Phillips, my XO, looked skeptical. A disease that turns people into... What? Zombies. This sounds like mass hysteria, sir. I'm not interested in what we call them, Commander, I replied. I'm interested in what we're going to do. This ship carries 40 aircraft and 1,600 personnel. We may be the only significant rescue asset available off the eastern seaboard. If those cities are indeed experiencing what appears to be a major biological incident. The communications console chirped. Rear Admiral Harrison's face appeared on screen, his expression grim. "Malcolm, are you seeing this? Pentagon just declared DEFCON 2. All U.S. forces are mobilizing, but many of their coastal installations are already reporting cases. They're requesting our assistance with evacuation efforts. What's the protocol here?" "Sir?" I asked. "We're not equipped for mass civilian evacuation." "There is no protocol for this, Captain," Harrison replied. "But there are millions of civilians in those coastal cities. The U.S. military is already overtaxed. We're the closest available naval asset with flight capabilities. Naval Command has authorized us to render all possible assistance." As I processed this information, Lieutenant Reed called out, "Sir, emergency broadcast from New York City authorities. They've designated multiple rooftop evacuation points. Civilian helicopters are already attempting extractions, but they're overwhelmed." I made my decision. "Commander Phillips, prepare flight operations immediately. I want all available helicopters ready for evacuation missions. Merlin crews first, followed by Wildcats. Lieutenant Commander Walsh, coordinate with U.S. authorities for evacuation priorities. Sir, interjected our chief medical officer, Dr. Eliza Moreau, who had joined us on the bridge. If this is indeed a pathogen, we need containment protocols. We can't risk bringing infection aboard. She was right, of course. A carrier is essentially a floating city with narrow corridors and confined spaces. If infection reached us, it would spread like wildfire. Establish a quarantine zone on the flight deck, I ordered. All evacuees must be screened before being allowed below decks. Anyone showing symptoms is to be isolated immediately. Within 30 minutes, our flight deck was transformed. The ship's company worked with remarkable efficiency, converting one of our hangars into a triage area. By 07 Afro, the first Merlin helicopters were airborne, heading toward designated extraction points in Boston. I watched them go, 4 dots growing smaller against the dawn sky. Through our long-range cameras, we could see smoke rising from multiple locations along the coastline. The cities were burning. Commander Phillips stood beside me, watching the same feed. "This doesn't feel real," he said quietly. "It's real enough for those people." I nodded toward the screen, and it's about to become very real for us. The first helicopters returned at 0742. I was on the flight deck as they landed, disgorging their passengers. Mostly families, many injured, all terrified. The looks on their faces as they stepped onto the deck of a British aircraft carrier, confusion, relief, shock, told me everything I needed to know about what they'd witnessed. A woman clutching a small child approached me, disoriented. "Are we safe here?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the rotor noise. "Yes, ma'am," I assured her, though I wasn't entirely convinced myself. "We'll get you somewhere secure." Our medical teams worked tirelessly, checking each evacuee for bites or scratches. 2 men were found with suspicious wounds and immediately isolated in our medical bay. Dr. Moreau established communication with CDC officials, trying to gather more information about the pathogen, its transmission and incubation period. At 08:15, I received a transmission from the captain of USS Gerald R. Ford, the American carrier that had been exercising with us. They too were conducting evacuation operations further south, focusing on Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. "It's spreading faster than anyone anticipated," Captain Rodriguez told me, his face haggard on the video screen. "We've had to turn away 2 civilian boats that approached with infected aboard. The situation on land." He paused. "Malcolm, I've seen combat in 3 theaters. Nothing compares to this." By 09 Sui, we had conducted 8 helicopter missions, rescuing approximately 240 civilians. But it was a drop in the ocean compared to the millions in danger. Our intelligence officer reported that military and civilian authorities were losing control of major population centers along the entire eastern seaboard. The infection wasn't just spreading. It was accelerating. During a brief moment of quiet on the bridge, Commander Phillips approached me. "Sir, we need to discuss sustainability. At current capacity, we can perhaps take on another 1,000 evacuees before resources become critical. Water, food, space, all finite." I nodded grimly. "I'm aware, but we can't simply stop." "No, sir," he agreed. "But we might need to consider where we're taking these people. We can't keep them aboard indefinitely." Before I could respond, alarms blared throughout the ship. "Medical emergency in Hangar 2, a voice announced over the intercom. "Security teams respond immediately." I grabbed the nearest communication handset. "Bridge to Hangar 2, report." Dr. Moreau's voice came through, breathless and urgent. "Captain, one of the evacuees we cleared has turned. He showed no symptoms, no bites. He just collapsed and then attacked a corpsman. We have him contained, but..." Another voice cut in. Lieutenant Davis from security. "Sir, we have the situation under control, but Corpsman Hayes has been bitten. Dr. Moreau has isolated him." Ice formed in my veins. The infection was aboard my ship. "Full lockdown of Hangar 2, I ordered. "No one in or out without my direct authorization. Dr. Moreau, I need options." The next hour was the most critical of the entire crisis. We suspended evacuation operations temporarily while I convened an emergency meeting with my senior staff. Dr. Moreau presented what little information we had about the pathogen. It appears to have an incubation period that varies widely, she explained. Some turn within minutes of exposure. Others may take hours. The man who turned showed no symptoms during screening because he wasn't symptomatic yet. So our screening protocols are useless, Commander Phillips stated flatly. Not entirely, Dr. Moreau countered. We can still identify those with obvious injuries or symptoms, but we need more stringent measures. I made a series of decisions that would define our response for the critical hours to follow. First, we would resume evacuation operations, but with modified protocols, all evacuees would remain on the flight deck or in secured hangars, physically separated from the ship's company. Second, we would coordinate with our escort vessels to transfer some evacuees to them, distributing the load. Third, we would maintain communication with British and American authorities to identify a secure location where evacuees could be safely offloaded. As these plans were implemented, I received a private communication from Rear Admiral Harrison. His face was grave on the secure video link. Malcolm, I need to inform you that London has authorized Protocol Blackstone if necessary. My blood ran cold. Protocol Blackstone was a containment measure of last resort, essentially the sacrifice of a compromised vessel to prevent wider contagion. It had never been implemented outside of theoretical exercises. Sir, we have the situation under control, I insisted. The infection is contained to one area. I believe you, Malcolm, Harrison replied, but you need to understand the stakes. This infection is now reported in 27 major cities worldwide. If your ship becomes compromised and reaches a populated port, he left the sentence unfinished. Understood, sir, I replied stiffly. But may I remind you that I have 1,600 crew and nearly 300 civilians aboard. Which is why I'm warning you privately, he said. Do everything in your power to maintain containment. I'll delay any extreme measures as long as possible. As I ended the transmission, I looked out over the vast flight deck of HMS Queen Elizabeth. 3 helicopters were preparing for another rescue mission. Below decks, my crew worked with professional discipline despite the extraordinary circumstances. And somewhere in Hangar 2, a former human being strained against restraints, driven by a pathogen that had, in the span of a few hours, brought human civilization to the brink of collapse. At 11:45, everything went to hell. I was reviewing evacuation protocols with Lieutenant Commander Walsh when Petty Officer Torres burst onto the bridge, his face slick with sweat, uniform disheveled in a way I'd never seen from the typically meticulous sailor. Captain, the situation in Hangar 2 is deteriorating rapidly. The infected man broke his restraints. He's bitten 2 medical staff, he reported, struggling to maintain his composure. Dr. Moreau attempted containment, but the infected man's strength was... Sir, he tore through thick leather restraints like they were paper. Security status? I demanded, already moving toward the tactical display where red warning indicators were beginning to multiply across the schematic of our lower decks. Multiple security personnel responding, but the hangar doors were briefly compromised during the struggle. Several evacuees may have scattered to adjacent sections, Torres continued. Chief Dixon reports the infected moved faster than anticipated. Their team wasn't prepared for the ferocity. This was my worst nightmare realized. The infection was no longer contained to a single area. Dr. Moreau confirmed my fears moments later via radio. The background noise a cacophony of shouting, and what sounded like gunfire. Captain, it's spreading faster than we anticipated. The newly infected are turning within minutes, not hours as we initially observed. We have at least 5, possibly more, loose on the lower decks. Security is overwhelmed. We need immediate reinforcement and authorization for... She hesitated. Terminal containment protocols. Terminal containment. The euphemism hung in the air like a guillotine blade. She was requesting permission to eliminate infected personnel before they could spread the contagion further. Commander Phillips looked at me from across the bridge. his weathered face revealing nothing, but his eyes asking the question he couldn't voice. The weight of 1,300 lives, crew and civilians, pressed down on my shoulders. The decision I made next would haunt me for the rest of my days. "Seal off all affected areas," I ordered, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Initiate Protocol Artemis. Authorization Forrester Delta 7-3. Phillips's eyes widened slightly. Protocol Artemis was designed for extreme biohazard containment, isolating compromised sections by sealing bulkheads, even if it meant sacrificing personnel trapped inside. It had never been implemented outside of training scenarios. It was a theoretical last resort that had suddenly become our only option. "Sir, we have medical staff and security teams in those sections," he reminded me quietly, stepping closer so others couldn't hear. "And at least 47 evacuees according to last head count." "I'm aware, Commander." My tone left no room for debate. "Execute the order." As Phillips relayed the commands, watching automated systems begin the process of sealing off 3 entire sections of the massive vessel, I moved to the central communication station. I needed to address the entire ship. They deserved to hear directly from me what was happening. I pressed the intercom button, hearing the familiar tone that signaled a ship-wide announcement. My finger hovered for a moment as I gathered my thoughts. There was no naval procedure for this, no carefully crafted speech prepared for a moment when you order your crew to potentially kill their shipmates. "All hands, this is the captain speaking." My voice echoed throughout the massive vessel. "We have a Level 1 biological threat aboard. Protocol Artemis has been initiated. Affected sections are being sealed. Any individual showing symptoms must be reported immediately. Anyone bitten or exposed to bodily fluids from infected individuals must self-identify to the nearest security team. This is not negotiable." I paused, knowing my next words would change everything about who we were as sailors, as people. "Be advised. I am authorizing security teams to use lethal force against any infected individual who poses a threat to others. I repeat, lethal force is authorized against infected personnel. This authorization extends to any crew member in a situation where containment has failed." I swallowed hard before continuing. "May God forgive us for what we must do today." The bridge fell silent as I released the button. In that moment, I felt the overwhelming solitude of command. No matter how many officers stood around me, this burden was mine alone. The next 30 minutes were consumed by chaos. Reports flooded in from throughout the ship. Security teams engaging infected crew members and evacuees, civilians panicking, medical staff desperately trying to identify anyone who might be infected before they turned. Through it all, I remained on the bridge, directing our response, making decisions that sent men and women to their deaths. Lieutenant Rodriguez, head of the Marine Security Detachment, reported the first casualty among the security teams, Corporal Jenkins, bitten while attempting to subdue an infected medical technician. Jenkins had shot himself rather than risk turning. Rodriguez's voice remained professional as he reported this, but I could hear the strain beneath his military bearing. At 12:20, automated alarms signaled a breach in bulkhead 47C. The infected had begun attempting to break through the sealed sections. I ordered reinforced security teams to establish a secondary containment perimeter, knowing we were consigning those trapped in the sealed sections to death, either by the infected or by our own security teams when the bulkheads finally failed. At 12:30, I received the damage assessment from Commander Phillips. 11 crew members confirmed dead or infected. 3 sections completely sealed off, containing an estimated 27 personnel whose status remained unknown. 27 evacuees showing potential symptoms, now isolated under heavy guard on the far end of the flight deck. The ship's chaplain, Lieutenant Hayes, requested permission to offer last rites to the infected, who were still lucid enough to understand. I approved it, though with strict safety protocols. Even in this nightmare, we would maintain our humanity where possible. Lieutenant Reed approached with another transmission from Rear Admiral Harrison. The young communications officer's hand trembled slightly as he handed me the secure handset. "Captain," Harrison's voice was grave, the connection periodically breaking up. We're receiving reports that HMS Defender has been compromised. Captain Williams reports multiple infected aboard. They're initiating Blackstone protocols. My stomach dropped, a cold weight settling in my chest. Defender was one of our escort destroyers with a crew of 190. I had served with Williams years ago on HMS Dauntless. A good man with a wife and 2 children waiting in Portsmouth. How? I demanded. They weren't conducting evacuation operations. Civilian boat approached claiming to need medical assistance. By the time they realized the civilians were infected, it was too late. Harrison's face hardened. Malcolm, there's more. We've lost contact with USS Gerald R. Ford. Their last transmission reported widespread infection throughout the ship. They were attempting to contain it, but the transmission crackled with static. An American supercarrier with over 4,500 personnel aboard, gone. The scale of the catastrophe was becoming clearer by the minute. This wasn't just an isolated incident. The entire naval response was collapsing. "What are your orders regarding Defender, sir?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Harrison's hesitation told me everything. They're scuttling the ship. Williams is giving infected crew members the option of honorable exit before detonation. Suicide. He was offering them suicide rather than turning into those things. A captain's final mercy to his crew. Understood, I managed. My throat tight with emotion I couldn't afford to show. And our orders. Maintain operational status. You're rapidly becoming one of our few remaining assets, Malcolm. London is. The situation there is deteriorating. The Admiralty's final order is to preserve your command at all costs and continue evacuation operations where possible. Final order. The implication was clear. Communication with Naval Command might not be possible much longer. By 13:00, we had regained tentative control of the situation aboard the Queen Elizabeth. The infected had been contained or neutralized. 23 crew members and 18 evacuees dead. A terrible toll. But the ship remained operational. I ordered a brief stand-down for essential personnel to rest and regroup. The strain was showing on everyone's faces, the hollow-eyed stare of people processing trauma while still in the middle of the crisis. Chief Engineer Lieutenant Commander Price reported that they had initiated emergency ventilation protocols, isolating air circulation systems to prevent potential airborne transmission. It meant some sections would grow uncomfortably hot or cold, but it might slow the spread if the pathogen could travel through ventilation systems. During this pause, I gathered my senior officers for a strategic assessment. "We need a plan," I told them, studying the nautical charts spread across the briefing table. "We can't continue taking on evacuees indefinitely. Supplies are limited, and each new group represents a potential contamination risk." Commander Phillips nodded grimly. "At current capacity, we can sustain approximately 4 more days before water rationing becomes necessary. Food stores could last longer with strict measures." Dr. Moreau, who had finally made it to the bridge after supervising containment efforts, looked exhausted. Blood spattered her medical whites, and a makeshift bandage wrapped her forearm where an infected had grabbed her. Through her protective gear, thankfully not breaking skin. "The pathogen appears to have an inconsistent incubation period," she reported. "Some turn within minutes of exposure. Others may carry it for hours before symptoms manifest. Our current screening protocols are inadequate." It was Lieutenant Commander Walsh who proposed our next move, pointing to a location on the chart. "Sir, there's Nantucket Island, approximately 100 nautical miles from our position. Primarily seasonal residents, low population density this time of year. If we could establish a secure perimeter..." She traced a circle around the island. "Natural barriers against the infected, limited access points to defend. A safe zone," I finished the thought. "Somewhere to offload evacuees. Somewhere defensible." I immediately contacted what remained of U.S. Coast Guard Command. Through broken and static-filled transmissions, they confirmed Nantucket's potential. The island had a small airport, natural barriers against the infected, and National Guard units were already attempting to secure it as a refugee point. The plan crystallized quickly. We would coordinate with the remaining U.S. military assets to establish Nantucket as a safe zone. Our helicopters would conduct evacuation operations from designated coastal points to the island. From there, smaller groups of thoroughly screened evacuees could be transferred to ships in our carrier group. We'll coordinate with ground forces, I told my officers. Prepare all remaining helicopters for continuous evacuation operations focusing on Nantucket. Our Wildcats will provide reconnaissance and security support. As the orders went out, I took a moment alone in my ready room. The small space, usually a refuge, now felt like a confessional booth. I stared at the photographs on my desk. My parents at their 40th anniversary, my sister with her children, the ship's company photo taken just 3 months ago. Faces of people who might already be dead, or worse. The intercom buzzed, interrupting my moment of weakness. I straightened my uniform, pushed aside personal concerns, and returned to the bridge. By 14 hours, our operation was in full swing. 4 Merlin helicopters were conducting continuous evacuations from designated points along the coast to Nantucket. 2 Wildcat helicopters provided reconnaissance, identifying safe extraction points and monitoring infected movements. At 14:15, we received disturbing reports from our first helicopters approaching Nantucket. Lieutenant Garcia's voice crackled over the radio, the background filled with the rhythmic thump of rotor blades. "Captain, the situation on the ground is deteriorating rapidly. National Guard has established a perimeter around the airport, but massive crowds of infected are approaching from the town. We are estimating at least 2,000, possibly more. His voice faltered. They're coming from all directions. Sir, ground forces request immediate air support. They can't hold the perimeter much longer." I studied the tactical display where our helo pilots had uploaded real-time imagery. The situation was dire. A thin line of National Guard troops establishing a defensive position around Nantucket Airport, while masses of infected pressed toward them from multiple directions. Hundreds of survivors had already gathered at the airport, waiting for evacuation that might not come if the defensive line broke. I made another fateful decision. Prepare 4 F-35s for close air support mission. Weapons free against infected threats only. Extreme precision required. Commander Phillips raised an eyebrow. Using fighter jets against ground targets in a civilian area. He didn't need to finish the thought. This would be unprecedented. Royal Navy aircraft conducting strike operations on American soil. These aren't conventional circumstances. I cut him off. Our pilots will use minimum necessary force to preserve the evacuation corridor. If those defenses fall, we lose the entire safe zone and potentially our best hope for a larger-scale evacuation. The Americans might object, Flight Commander Wilson noted, though he was already preparing the mission briefing. The Americans requested our assistance, I reminded him, and their chain of command is increasingly fragmented. We make this call. Within 30 minutes, our fighters were prepared. I personally briefed the pilots, making the gravity of the situation clear. Precision is paramount, I emphasized. Your targets are only infected individuals threatening the defensive perimeter. Create barriers where possible. Use buildings, vehicles, terrain features to channel them away from the airport. This is not about killing. It's about buying time for evacuation. Squadron Leader Matthews, our lead pilot, nodded grimly. Understood, sir. Rules of engagement. We're beyond conventional rules of engagement, I replied. Use your judgment. Protect the living. Those infected individuals. I hesitated, then said what we all knew. They're already dead. By 15, our fighters were airborne, providing support to the beleaguered ground forces on Nantucket. The pilots' reports painted a grim picture. Thousands of infected swarming toward the airport perimeter, where hundreds of survivors had gathered, hoping for evacuation. I monitored their operations from the bridge, watching thermal imagery transmitted from the fighters' sensors. The masses of infected appeared as swarms of heat signatures, moving with that terrible single-minded determination I'd witnessed in Boston. Our F-35s conducted precision strikes against the largest concentrations, creating barriers of destroyed vehicles and debris to slow their advance. The pilots used minimal ordnance, focusing on channeling rather than elimination, an impossible task given the numbers involved. "This is Raptor 1, Matthews reported after his third pass. "We've established temporary barriers on the eastern and southern approaches. National Guard is reinforcing with available materials, but the northern approach remains vulnerable. Too many civilians in the area for a strike mission. I authorized a Merlin helicopter to drop additional security teams to reinforce the northern perimeter. As these operations continued, our remaining helicopters worked relentlessly, ferrying survivors from the island to ships in our carrier group and bringing in additional supplies and ammunition to the defenders. By 16 Quo, the situation on Nantucket had stabilized, if precariously. The defensive perimeter held, reinforced by our air support. Evacuation operations continued, prioritizing children, the elderly, and the injured. At 16:30, disaster struck again. I was on the flight deck, personally overseeing the processing of a group of evacuees when it happened. Merlin helicopter Bravo 3 was approaching for landing, full of evacuees from Nantucket. As it hovered above the deck, something went wrong. The helicopter lurched violently to one side before spinning out of control. "Clear the deck," I shouted, diving for cover and pulling a nearby deck crewman with me as the Merlin crashed, rotors shattering as they struck the deck. Metal screamed against metal, sparks flying as the fuselage skidded across the flight deck. Fuel ignited, sending flames racing across the deck's surface. Damage control teams responded immediately, battling the blaze with foam suppressant while others rushed to pull survivors from the wreckage. In the chaos, no one noticed immediately what had caused the crash until a flight deck crewman screamed. One of the evacuees, a middle-aged man in a torn business suit, had emerged from the wreckage. His movements were wrong, staggered, aggressive, focused. Blood covered his face and hands, his eyes vacant yet somehow filled with terrible hunger. He had turned during the flight, attacked the pilot, and caused the crash. Now he lunged at the nearest crewman, teeth bared. 2 deck security personnel opened fire immediately, dropping him with multiple shots. In the aftermath, we discovered the terrible truth. The man had been bitten before boarding but had concealed the wound beneath his clothing. He had turned mid-flight, attacking the pilot and causing the catastrophic crash. The final toll: 7 dead, including both pilots and 5 evacuees. 14 injured, 3 critically. A section of our flight deck temporarily unusable until emergency repairs could be completed. As I helped coordinate the medical response, a young woman was pulled from the wreckage, her leg clearly broken. She clutched my arm, her eyes wild with fear. "My daughter," she gasped. "Emily. She was with me. 6 years old. Blue dress." I stayed with her as medical teams searched the wreckage, eventually finding the child, unconscious but alive, protected by her mother's body during the crash. The moment they were reunited, something tightened in my chest, a reminder of what we were fighting for. Not just survival, but humanity itself. Despite the disaster, we continued operations. Flight Commander Wilson reorganized our remaining aircraft, adjusting flight patterns to use the undamaged portions of the deck. Our helicopters had evacuated over 600 people from Nantucket to various ships in our group. The F-35s had successfully helped ground forces establish a defensible perimeter around the airport. Reports from the mainland grew increasingly dire. Boston was considered lost, with military forces withdrawing to defensive positions outside the city. New York was under martial law, with fighting reported throughout Manhattan. Washington had gone dark entirely, with no clear information about the status of the U.S. government. At 17:30, I received a transmission that nearly broke me. Commander Sullivan of HMS Diamond, our remaining destroyer, reported that HMS Defender had gone silent, the scuttling complete. 190 souls lost, including Captain Williams. Sullivan's voice wavered slightly as he reported this, the only break in military protocol I'd heard from him in years of service. As the sun began to set over the Atlantic, I stood on the bridge of HMS Queen Elizabeth, surveying what remained of our operation. The day's toll was devastating. Multiple naval vessels lost, hundreds of military personnel dead or infected, and countless civilians lost to the spreading pandemic. The repairs to the flight deck continued under floodlights, teams working frantically to restore full operational capacity. Medical staff moved between evacuees, checking for symptoms, providing what comfort they could. Security teams maintained vigilant watch, their faces showing the strain of having to view every civilian as a potential threat. Yet amid this terrible tableau, I saw moments of profound humanity. A naval chaplain leading prayers for a mixed group of crew members and civilians. A young rating sharing his ration with an elderly evacuee. Medical staff working beyond exhaustion to treat the injured and comfort the dying. "Orders, sir?" Commander Phillips asked quietly, standing beside me as darkness gathered. The question held more weight than just tactical decisions. He was asking for direction in a world that no longer made sense. "We continue evacuation operations through the night," I replied. "Establish shifts to allow flight crews rest. Maintain our security protocols." I paused, watching the memorial flags that had been raised for those we'd lost. "And prepare a memorial service for tomorrow morning, for those we've lost." As night fell fully, I received one final report from Lieutenant Commander Walsh. Communications were degrading rapidly worldwide. Major cities across Europe were now reporting widespread infection. The pandemic had gone global. Government broadcasts were becoming sporadic, replaced by emergency messages and, increasingly, silence. I thought of my family in Portsmouth, my elderly parents in Cornwall. Were they safe? Would I ever see them again? Had Britain fallen as quickly as the eastern United States? Such thoughts had to be pushed aside. I had a ship to command, people to save. At 23:30, exactly 18 hours after the first reports of the outbreak, I recorded a brief log entry. HMS Queen Elizabeth remains operational. Evacuation efforts continuing. Estimated 700 civilians rescued. 46 crew members lost. We appear to be one of the few remaining large-scale rescue assets on the eastern seaboard. For those still waiting on shore, we represent perhaps their final hope. I cannot say what tomorrow will bring, but as long as this ship remains afloat, we will continue our mission. For humanity's sake, we must. I signed off and stepped out onto the bridge wing. The night air was cold against my face, carrying the salt tang of the Atlantic. Below on the flight deck, I could see the silhouettes of helicopters preparing for another rescue mission, their rotors slowly turning. Beyond them, the darkness of the Atlantic stretched to the horizon, broken only by the navigation lights of our remaining escort vessels. Along the distant coastline, fires burned in cities that had been bustling metropolises just hours ago. Somewhere out there, the world I had known was dying. But here, on this steel island, we fought on. Not just for Queen and country now, but for the survival of our species. The battle had only just begun.